Television star and acclaimed chef Michael Fenster is one of the US's leading cardiologists and one of 15 doctors globally to hold culinary and medical degrees. He's also the only interventional cardiologist and professional chef to do so, and the only cardiologist with joint academic appointments in both the medical and culinary arts. Now, Professor Fenster doesn't believe setting boundaries when it comes to food. He says ideas that healthy food can't be flavorful or tasty food can't be good for you, or that even a one-size-fits-all healthy diet exists, they're all myths. Professor Fenster, one by one, is busting those myths. And today we have Professor Fenster with us. Thank you for joining us on The Informer, Professor. Now, you say through the power of culinary medicine, people can be armed with evidence-based knowledge on the relationship between food and their body. Go on about that, please.
Oh, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me, Michael. You know, one of the things, and this has been exciting because I've been doing this work for well over a decade, started on it many decades ago because of my own personal health challenges. And what I've really seen over about the last 3 years or so is just worldwide explosion in the data that really shows that we need to move beyond nutrients and calories in terms of looking at that food health relationship. And it's so much more. And when we look back, it sort of makes sense. You know, for example, the nutrients we focus on, and everybody talks about, the saturated fat and the salt and this and that, they make up, there's maybe about 150 or so that we follow around the world that are involved in the study of nutrition. As we know, food that we eat contains almost 27,000 compounds. So when we look at that, what we find is we're looking at a little over maybe 0.5% of the compounds in food. And for example, many of those compounds are things like herbs and spices. Everybody's familiar with those. And certainly they don't count a lot when we look at it in terms of dietary energy. But what we're finding is things like that contain powerful bioactives, is what we call them. And these compounds can actually turn our own genes on and off, depending what our own DNA is. And so these have profound implications in our health and wellness, well beyond just sort of calories and nutrient compounds. And we're really finding that one of the keys, believe it or not, is simply getting back to nature. So it's about the ingredients that we use. It's about the sourcing, and it's about sort of letting Mother Nature do her thing and feed us.
Sadly, nowadays, a good diet seems to be judged mistakenly on body weight. It's a lot more involved than that, isn't it, Professor?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the colleagues here in the States, Chip Levy from Oxford University in the state of Louisiana here, wrote a great book called The Obesity Paradox. And most people are unaware that the healthiest group of people are actually not those, as we go by BMI, in the ideal category, but those that are actually slightly overweight. And so we have many people, for a lot of reasons, that are in what we might call a healthy or ideal weight, that are what we would term metabolically ill. They tend to be those of Asian descent because they tend to be thinner with a smaller bone structure, a little less musculature, so they can carry that weight in their bellies, which is one of the warning signs that it's not the amount of fat, it's not the body weight, but more so where that body weight is distributed that correlates with disease. And conversely, we have people very often here in the States, for example, African Americans, who are very big, carry a lot of muscle. And if you just went by their weight, they would be technically obese, but they're incredibly fit. So just using that BMI, which is an interesting story because it was originally developed by a polymath, a Belgian polymath, who was working for an insurance company. And the whole idea of this was really based on about 150 Belgian soldiers at the time. And then Ansel Keys in the 1970s was looking for about 4 different measures where a doctor could go in an office and kind of get an idea of somebody's health by simple measures like height and weight. But both of those gentlemen were adamant that this should never, ever be applied to individuals. It's a population measure. It's subject to something we call the ecological fallacy, which is what's true for large groups does not hold for individuals. So if you, and I'm sure you do, have a wonderfully fast sporty Lamborghini car, you're more likely, statistically speaking, to get a speeding ticket than me in my old junky pickup. But however, while that applies to groups, it falls apart individually because it depends on you, the individual, and your driving habits and mine. And in full disclosure, I have a history of a lot of speeding tickets.
It makes sense when you look at it, when we realize the importance of vitamins, minerals, all of those micronutrients. Surely those that are taking in more of them would have more to spare, more to use.
Yeah, so the vitamins, the vitamins, the minerals, the nutrients, they are very important. Absolutely, you're absolutely right. But one thing that we've ignored, and this actually is another fascinating thing that has to do with how the history of nutrition, which in the terms of science is a very young science. It's only about 100, 150 years old or so, developed. And it developed because it looked at deficiencies. And it looked at people had scurvy and said, hey, you need some vitamin C. It looked at people at rickets and said, hey, it's vitamin D. So nutrients play a big role when we look at deficiency diseases. But here, particularly in westernized modern nations, we don't suffer from deficiency. We suffer from chronic disability and disease. And the food health potential, that equation, is a function of those nutrients, what we call the composition effect, what foods are made of. But to a greater degree, they are dependent on what's called the matrix effect. So that's, the shell that nature packages the egg in. And that structure is critical. So, for example, I can take some buffalo milk mozzarella and some buffalo milk ricotta, which are made from the same batch of milk. And if I read those ingredients, it's exactly the same. I just change the way I make it with the technique and the amount of heat and so on. And yet our bodies respond to them completely differently, even to the degree of how one might satiate our hunger, another one, how it's metabolized physiologically. So we have ignored this matrix component in the equation. And why that is so critically important is because when we ultra process food, we destroy nature's matrix. And then we try to put it back together. And when we put it back together, we add things. And it turns out those things are not so good for us and not good for the bacteria in our gut, which again, over only in the last decade or so, we've learned is so critical for our health. In medicine, we really consider it an organ. Those bacteria are an organ in there. And again, they are turning our genes on and off as well. So all of this comes into play. And I think it's one reason why we're now looking at foods from a different perspective. And that's really what culinary medicine is. It's quantum gastronomy. It's shifting our perspective in a whole new way to not look at something as whether it's a pizza or not a pizza, but to look at it, is it ultra processed or not ultra processed? And it opens up a whole new world. And it turns out that viewpoint correlates and gives us great insight into health and wellness. And that's great news for people like me who love pizza.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned the matrix, and one of the prime examples I would suggest would be trying to refreeze ice cream or reheat a chip. It just exact same chemicals. Can't do it.
Yeah, it's exactly that. Matrix, has been altered. And when you try to put that back together, it just doesn't work. Our bodies have not evolved to consume those types of things as food. And I've had patients who've told me, obviously I share culinary medicine, with my patients, and they say, well, I took some margarine, some fake butter, and put it out there and nothing touched it. It sat out there for 2 days and nothing ate it. I put a stick of butter out there and there's bugs on it and things are eating it, and it's gone, in 20 minutes. But the other stuff said the natural world did not recognize what we eat as food. And that should really be telling us something, I think.
All right, Professor, let's nail down some tips for pointers. Artificially sweetened foods. Yes, no.
No.
Yeah, we've got more and more of them, and we've never been heavier as a population. So obviously they aren't doing what they're intended. Negative side effects from them?
Yeah, so that's an interesting story because it gets back to what I talked about originally of moving beyond simply looking at calories. Because if we said how we have to reduce calories and that equals health, then what you just said, artificially sweetened beverages, they should be like the healthiest things because they have 0 calories, they give us pleasure, etc. Unfortunately, a lot of these ways that they're sweetened still turn on our reward center in our brain, the dopaminergic reward center. And we respond to foods like that in the same way we respond to opiate medications. And certainly here in the States, we have not exactly done a bang up job managing that issue.
Mm.
And it really gets back to, again, the ultra processed foods because they are manufactured in this way with the addition of things like that, and we would call those MUPs, markers of ultra processing, with additional layers of salt and sweeteners and fats, etc., to become what is we term politely hyper palatable, but the real word for that is addictive. So it's food that's been torn apart, reconstructed to be cheap and to be addictive so that you crave it and then you want to go back for more and more and more and spend more and more money.
And am I right? Did I read somewhere that you're more likely to overconsume calories in the next meal because your body's insulin response has been turned on with those artificially sweetened foods, searching for calories, which then opens up the storage pathway into the fat cells because that insulin can't remain in the bloodstream?
Absolutely spot on, Michael, right? So our brain can't tell if the sweetness is coming from sugar, natural sugars, or it's coming from, something that's artificial. So basically, as you said, you've turned on the machine, and so it's there looking for something, and it doesn't find it. And that leads to, untoward consequences. And, the other thing is that some of those types of sweeteners, like high fructose corn syrup, because it has a lot of immediately available fructose, which is not how nature packages fructose, because it's wrapped up in fiber. So it's slowly released when you eat an apple, for example. But when you drink a soda beverage like a Coca-Cola or something, that bolus of fructose goes in and it actually shuts down your hunger response in your brain and sends all of your machinery to store fat. So it does the two worst things that are possible.
All right, so we've cleared that up. Anyone watching, low sugar, artificially sweetened, in the bin, they're not working. Low
Absolutely.
fat.
Yeah, anything that's of these artificial type of constructions are turning out to be really bad. For example, people often say, well, I love mayonnaise. Certainly we use it a lot here in the States for sandwiches and spreads. Mayonnaise, particularly the low-fat mayonnaise, contain things like emulsifiers, like what's something called carboxy methylcellulose, or CMC.
Sounds delicious.
Yeah, well, and it's actually not a food. It is made as a waste product from cotton and wood manufacture. Primarily, it's made from wood chips, and was released here in the States back in the 1960s. It was approved based on laws called GRAS, generally recognized as safe, that date all the way back to the 1950s. And it was never really studied because it was felt that, well, we don't metabolize it, so it's not going to do anything to us. The problem is, to go back to our minions, those bacteria in our cells. Actually, just about 2 months ago, they published the studies that showed that it decimates the gut bacteria in a very bad way and sets people up to develop chronic low-level inflammation that's associated not only with irritable bowel syndrome and inflammatory bowel syndrome, but set up to develop obesity, which we now know is an inflammatory disease, not simply a disease of how many calories you eat. Type 2 diabetes, and of course that opens the gateway for heart disease, certain types of cancers, et cetera, et cetera.
Now, you mentioned fiber. Fiber is really important because of that gut biome that we've already mentioned. And now the latest research, am I correct in saying that we realize that all of our feel-good hormones in our brains, our dopamine, serotonins, are actually a result of those bacteria within our stomach?
Well, yeah, so these bacteria, they communicate with us all the time. We used to think, certainly, back in the dark ages, years and years ago when I was in medical school, we were taught that basically it was the brain sending signals telling the gut, our GI system, what to do. Well, it turns out that it's not like that at all. It's like that old freeway used to drive in LA, Michael, back and forth, wall to wall traffic up and down. So it's this all the time bidirectional communication. And these bacteria secrete messengers that get into our bloodstream and have effects. And in fact, if we were to draw a random blood sample, about 40% of the communication molecules in any random sample actually start from the gut, including the gut bacteria. And as you mentioned, one of the things that they secrete is serotonin, which can go to our brain. So literally, if you eat something that the bacteria like, and those good bacteria get happy, they secrete serotonin, which then goes to your brain and makes you happy. And in a very odd moment here, we both have to think, who's really controlling who? Who's setting the stage for what we want to eat? So it's almost like Invasion of the Body Snatchers. But it does go to show in a larger way how connected we are to the earth, to our food, and to what we eat, for everything that makes us human in terms of our emotions and how we respond. And that this gut bacteria, this organ that we have, they're really the front line there, running interference, for us in terms of interacting with our environment and the foods that we eat.
That's another really interesting point, Professor, mentioning emotions. Now, we know that stress raises cortisol and anxiety, and we seem to have a bit of a plague at the moment with anxiety in the modern world. Could our diet be playing a part in that, or is the anxiety impacting our gut biome which way, or is it a backwards and forwards again?
I think it's backwards and forwards from what we can discern from the data so far. When we have an unhealthy diet, it changes our gut bacteria. And that correlates with things like depression, risk of autism. And in fact, in a study, I got a pre-release copy. I'm not even sure it's published yet, or it might have come out this week. I was reading it last week. It showed that from the highest quartile to the lowest quartile in terms of how much ultra-processed food you eat, the more ultra-processed food you eat, the higher your risk of dementia. And that highest to lowest group, that risk was over 50% increased risk. So it impairs our cognitive function and can obviously affect our emotions because it is associated with depression. But we also know that depression, because it affects our immune system from a central origin, meaning our brain, and then kind of the effects flow from there, can also negatively affect our gut bacteria. And a simple stress, I certainly did a lot before the COVID days, but as we are trying to get back and do more traveling, a simple physical stress like going to a different time zone can negatively affect your gut bacteria. So they are very sensitive to us as their host, as their life partner in a way, to the stresses that we feel. It affects them. But likewise, when we don't treat them very well, it ends up affecting us.
All right, now a biggie that everyone would want to know. So while we've got the expert here, supplementation, where do we stand on that?
I think it really depends on the individual and the supplement. I think you have to look at each one individually. So for example, if you have a balanced, healthful diet, in general, you don't need lots of extra supplementations from things. Having said that, certainly we just mentioned, the stress of traveling. So if I'm traveling on the road for a long time, going here, there, different time zones every 2 or 3 days, I will take probiotics with me to, help. I try to eat well, which supplies the prebiotics, which are the food for the probiotics. But that would be a supplement. When I'm at home eating what I normally do and cook, I don't need to do that. But in terms of, sort of these people that come into the office with a laundry list of, vitamins and supplements, and they're spending hundreds and hundreds of, dollars each month. Most people don't need those. In certain cases, I think you do. Certainly some supplements like chondroitin sulfate has been shown to be helpful for people with, joint issues. But again, these are small and specific areas. The study on just generally trying to take vitamins, for example, for health, that's always kind of been a wash and never been shown to be a benefit. And especially if you eat, a good diet, you don't need that. So if you have a specific need, talk to a healthcare professional or a nutritionist or a dietitian, and see if it's right for you. And sometimes, like me, it may only be right in certain circumstances when you need it.
And we also need to be careful where people will say they're natural, they can't do any harm. Well, that means they're inert and can't do any good either. Iron toxicity is a really common one, and the number of women I encounter in my former life as a strength and conditioning that were just taking it just because they were told that, you know, they're likely iron deficient. And, you know, that's what you say to them, well, hemochromatosis is nearly as, you know, prominent as diabetes. So you could be doing yourself some damage, and the interaction, vitamin C might increase the uptake and all of these things. So to do it off your own or with the 16-year-old's advice from the supplement store, probably not a great idea, Professor?
Absolutely spot on, Michael. You know, I have a couple of comments to that. One is arsenic is also very natural. And a lot of that is not so good. And two, a great example, excuse me, is calcium supplementation. So for years and years in the States here, we said, well, you know, it's calcium, there's no harm in it. So let's have women take it, because when they're at risk for osteoporosis, we give them more calcium, that'll be good. Well, it turns out that actually we increase their risk of cardiovascular disease by about 30%, because that big bolus of calcium is not how we normally eat and then metabolize it. And it turns out that one, it didn't go to the bones. Where it went was into the walls of the blood vessels and started to cause atherosclerosis, which obviously is a cause of heart attacks. And so that whole idea of let's just give vitamin C, give calcium, which seems so innocuous. It's like, well, what could possibly happen? It turned out that we were killing people by increasing their risk of significant cardiovascular disease and mortality by 30%.
Yeah. Now, Professor, it's been fantastic. I could talk about this all day, but I believe you've got a new television show.
Yes. I was just working. It's airing on our public broadcasting system here in the United States called House Calls with Chef Dr. Mike. We're very excited about that. Can't wait to come and bring a version to Oz and visit you and all my friends down there. But we're very excited. And in that program, we help individuals, which hopefully inspire our audience in general, by using these methods and approaches of culinary medicine that you and I have talked about, to solve their food challenges.
Great. Well, I can't wait to see it. So, Doctor or Professor Mike Fenster, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you, Michael. It's been such a pleasure. And hello to all my friends down under.